But you're going to get rid of her. Didn't you say you're going to get rid of her? Oh, that was good.
Pastor, you got a PowerPoint struck back here?
Yeah, it's there. The hour has come.
You are now on.
Right. Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, well, let's see. Last week, I very carefully laid a foundation. The basic theme here, the subject.
Check your mic.
Actually, what you mean is turn it on. How about that? Okay. You know, a journey of 1,000 miles fails if you don't take the last step. Okay, realities and relationships is what I'm talking about, because we're beginning a discussion of the first article of the Apostles' Creed. The first article of the Apostles' Creed basically covers everything other than the actual truths of the kingdom. So it's discussing the basics of life and the world in which we live, the fundamental elements of religious thought, of whatever religion you are, and if you attempt to be non-religious altogether, these are still questions that you have to ask and wrestle with. They don't, by themselves, automatically have anything to do with Jesus. They really do, of course, we know. But when I talk about realities and relationships, I mean, what is real? What is the world in which we live really like? And what are the relationships? We've been talking about the relationships among human beings, but since central to Christian thought is God, a number one reality of Christianity is God. And then, so when we talk about relationships, we're talking about what does God do? What do we owe Him? What does He do for us? What is His role in things? All right, last week we focused on, and so I'm going to quickly review here. We talked about methodological naturalism. When I say naturalism, I am not referring to tree hugging. I'm not referring to people who like streams and clean water and clouds and all of that. That's a different sense of naturalism. What I mean by naturalism is a naturalist essentially assumes that nature sort of runs by itself. It's a series of cause and effects and properties that are sort of inherent in things, okay? So I talked about methodological naturalism, naturalism as a method, and we talked about this being actually quite commonsensical. Most of us are methodological naturalists in our day-to-day life. We just assume that things are going to happen according to the normal rules. Whether you believe that God is behind it or not, you still could say, well, When I flip the switch, the light will go on. When I pour the water will go down and not up, and all these sorts of things. And we just sort of assume that. So we're not constantly praying to God for every little thing. We just assume that his creation is going to go on operating in a normal way, in a predictable way. So methodological naturalism is perfectly fine. Empiricism means that we're going to take measurements and observations to see how it is that the universe actually ordinarily operates. Physics is all about the study of the physical operations of the universe. Again, from a Christian point of view, it just means that we're going to study what God has made and how the things that God has made operate. Physics is going to be contrasted to metaphysics, which we'll talk about in just a second. Metaphysics has to do with sort of the overarching realities behind the things that we're actually measuring, okay? And then science is really nothing more than a practical application of what we learn in physics, and it is an example of methodological naturalism, okay? If we want to learn, the example I gave is if we wanted to learn at what temperature water boils, then we will take measurements and adjust the pressures and see what temperature the water boils, and we'll take careful measurements. And we are going to assume, for the point of view of our measurements, that nothing supernatural is going to happen, okay? I, as a Christian, know full well that God could prevent this water from boiling at 212 degrees, make it boil at a much higher level, make it freeze at 300 degrees if he wants. He can do whatever he wants. I, as a Christian, know that. But I'm going to assume that he's not going to mess around with my little experiment here. And so I will count on my... And that's all science is. There's absolutely nothing in science that contradicts... Science understood this way, as methodological naturalism. In other words, what I'm really saying is, nothing has been discovered in the natural world that overthrows the truths that we are taught in Scripture. Nothing at all. And we'll get more into that here momentarily. Metaphysics, as I mentioned, is sort of the study or the contemplation of the truths behind the stuff we see. Okay? Human beings are by nature, we live in a metaphysical world. What was that old joke? Well, it wasn't really a joke, but it was some model or something or another, and some college study had added up all of the materials that are in the typical human body and determined that the typical human body had $2.17 worth of elements in there, you know. And so she was asked about this, and she made some quip about how it's not what it is, it's how it's put together, or something like that. At any rate, of course, nobody would look at somebody we love, a child or a parent or a spouse, and reduce them to their elements. We all know that there's just something much, much more about life than just the sheer stuff of life. This is so elementary that anybody that doesn't live like that, I mean, they can't be a human being. Human beings don't live in a purely empirical, naturalistic world. Okay? Sparrows do. Amoeba do. Dogs do. People don't. We go through day after day, week after week, month after month, thinking about big and wonderful things that have absolutely nothing to do or very little to do with actual natural reactions and counter-reactions and forces and all of that. I mean, unless you just happen to be into designing and building things, and even then, you're just thinking on a much higher plane. Religion is a kind of metaphysics. You really might also say religion generically and metaphysics is practically the same thing. It is the inquiry into what things are really like. We can all measure. Okay? We can all measure at what temperature water boils. But if we're going to create a model in terms of what water really is and why it boils, we can go down to the point of view of atoms and and the electrical forces that hold them together and thermodynamics and all of that. But we're still really just talking about physical things. Sooner or later, you're going to come down to, yeah, but where did all this stuff come from and what does it matter? And now we're into metaphysics, okay? Why do we live? What does it matter? Where are we going? What's important? What's good? What's bad? Does any of that make any sense at all? This is the stuff of human life. It's all metaphysical or religious kind of inquiry. Theology is a particular kind of religion. Our religion is theocentric. Religion does not have to be theocentric. So I'm talking about realities in relationships. The number one reality of Christianity is not that there is a truth out there. Everybody believes that. Even if they deny it, they've just affirmed that, okay? But not everybody believes that there's a personal God out there. So for Christians, it's not just that God exists, it's that what we mean by God, an all-powerful, omniscient, completely sovereign God who is good and personal and who is not only responsible for all things, but is intimately involved in our daily lives. There's much more we could say as Christians about God. However, a Christian has a particular approach and understanding to religious reality, and the centerpiece of that is God. There is no discussions of reality apart from God, not even hypothetical. We don't say, well, hypothetically, if there was no God, then, okay, if there was no God, then there's nothing to talk about. Because as far as we're concerned, there is no such thing as anything that is not generated, created, and sustained by God. Okay? It's just not, it is a naturalistic assumption that things have properties of their own. And that if you want to believe in God, God is an add-on. But water does what water does because that's the way water is. If you want to believe in God, that's fine. But water is the way water is because that's the way water is. Naturalism says things have properties of their own and they interact in cause and effect ways because that's the way things are. For the Christian, the only thing that we say that's the way it is because that's the way it is God. Everything else is the way it is because that's the way God makes it, wills it, does it, okay? That's it. So for us, the entire physical universe is nothing more than an exploration of the will and workings of God. For the naturalist, there's no going behind the way things are. It's just that way. And no further explanation is necessary unless you want to get at some other natural explanation. But sooner or later, they're even going to say with that, that's just the way it is. For the Christian, we're never going to end with it, that's just the way it is, unless we're talking about God. Okay? So in one sense, I want you to understand that there is no difference between the naturalist and the Christian theologian on the point that sooner or later you're going to get to a, that's just the way it is. And when they tell you that we actually explain things where you just believe, you can utter some expletives at them, but I wouldn't. I would just say, that's not true. Okay, sooner or later, both of us get to sort of the irreducible, we can't go beyond that. For us, we're quite honest about it. It's God. We don't even try to go behind God. There's no explaining God. There's no trying to understand. That's it. Once you get to God, you're done, okay? The naturalist just makes nature into what we call God. It's not a personal God. It's not an intelligent God. It's not a good God. It's just the ultimate explanation of everything. In other words, creation is because creation is. Okay? For us, we say God is because God is. And they say, wait a minute, you can't do that. I said, well, yes, we just did. Okay, that's the nature of God. But when they say creation is just because that's the way creation is, now we can say, you can't do that unless nature is God. Okay? You're not allowed to say that. Okay. Metaphysical naturalism is different than methodological naturalism. Metaphysical naturalism, or methodological naturalism just says, I'm going to assume that God is not going to intervene in any of this, that everything is going to happen according to the normal rules. Fine. Metaphysical naturalism says there is no possibility of anything supernatural happening here because everything happens according to natural forces and laws, and that's it. That is very different than methodological naturalism, which just says, for practical purposes, we're going to ignore God. Although he can intervene whenever he wants, methodological naturalism is a religious tenet. It is saying there's no God out there to intervene. Or if there is, he's subject to the laws of nature also. Why did God make water this way? Well, he had to. Whenever you hear somebody say God had to, that's a marker that we have a problem. God never has to, okay? Now, so metaphysical naturalism is a religious idea. It is not something discovered in a test tube. It's not that science went about trying to figure out whether there's supernatural things, and shazam, we found out there isn't any, so here's this new truth. It's not that way. The ancient Greeks used to toy around with this idea that there's no gods, it's just everything is just what it is. I mean, they also thought about this. And the roots of this are not in scientific inquiry. It is another assumption, a religious assumption. The only thing is, they won't call it religious. Now, I'll call it religious because it has all of the same features as any religion. It is explaining what ultimate reality looks like. And for them, what ultimate reality looks like is matter and energy, swirling around, and that's it. That for them is ultimate reality. That is a metaphysical statement, that's all there is. For the Christian, we say, no, that's not, there be nothing. The only thing that just is and exists in and of itself is God. That's it. And apart from God, there is nothing that just is. Only God. And whatever properties other things have, they have those properties by virtue of God, and that's that. Metaphysical naturalism is oftentimes called materialism. It just means material is all there is. Matter and energy, there isn't anything else. We oftentimes will refer to this as atheism. This is atheism in the modern Western sense. The modern Western sense of atheism is that there's just really nothing out there, including God. There is no objective, transcendent truth out there. There's just the universe, the big, dark universe, and that's it. And sooner or later, all of our atoms will just be cold and dust in the wind, and that's all we are, and that's all we ever were, and that's it. But it is possible to have a deeply religious and supernatural understandings of things, but no God, or no God that looks like our God, no personal God. So atheism is not necessarily naturalism or materialism, okay? But for our purposes in Western culture here in America, if somebody says I'm an atheist, what they probably mean, they probably don't mean that, I'm some kind of a pantheist or monist or something like that. They probably mean I believe in a rational universe where matter and energy is all that exists, and therefore there is no God. Okay? Any questions or thoughts on any of this before we move on? This is a very quick review. All right. Then the real conflict between naturalism and Christianity, that is the fundamental thing, is not so much whether there's a God or not. I mean, yeah, that obviously is a conflict. There's lots of conflicts, but naturalism, think of the name. Naturalism says everything according to the nature of things. Okay? It denies the supernatural. What does supernatural mean? That means that there are powers and forces out there that are not subject to, and that they're not part of nature. Okay? For the Christian, you can ask about angels. Are angels subject to natural law? My answer is, I actually don't know. They may have their own laws out there. I don't know. But I know this, God is not subject. So there is this ultimate supernatural thing out there And it can intervene in our world here anytime it wants, and it is not bound by anything that binds us. Okay? The Christian says that is true. The naturalist says that is false. And we are not going to bridge that gap. But I'm going to show you some ways in which we attempt to do it. And what you end up with is neither fish nor fowl. Okay? So supernatural, we just believe that God is absolutely not subject to the laws of nature that he has created. He is the ultimate reality, not anything else. And we're comfortable with that. All right, let's think about Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1 tells us about the creation of all things. Now, if I were to ask you, what is the conflict between science and creation? The age of the earth. What else? How many days can we say that God created everything in days? Okay, how about this? Supposing we say, well, it's 6 days. Genesis says 6 days, okay? But how long is a day? Right? Is that a legitimate question? How long is a day? The first day, there was no sun. There was no earth rotating, so who's to say whether that first day was millions, billions of years, right? Something that was said to me very early on, shortly after we started to go to church, the pastor made the comment that he was always baffled at the sixth-day creation and how that could be. And he said, quite honestly, why wasn't it just an instant? Why 6 whole days? I mean, what's with that? You stop and think about that. Why did God take so long? Not, how could he do it so quickly? Well, we'll talk more about that. Okay, so we can debate the stuff that we see that says this must be at least 15 billion years old. And then we say, but God is the one, otherwise 15 billion years would not produce what we have here today. So God is the one who's been guiding this all this time. Or we think this way. God, what we mean that by supernatural is that God is able to tweak natural things. Right? That's what a miracle is. God tweaks the natural and does it a different way. Maybe he accelerates it, makes it go much faster, so that 10 billion years are reduced into 1 day. Well, God can do that. Okay. And then we may look at Genesis 1 and note that, of course, he created light first, and then he created the planet, but with all water, and then he created the earth and we can try to imagine how, well, we had to have the sun first before he creates the plants on the land, right? Because in the third day, he created the land and the plants on the land. But he had to create the sun first, right? Well, of course, there wasn't any sun until the fourth day. But it's okay. He created light before that. Or I heard the explanation, yeah, but I mean, even plants can survive 1 day without the sun. Is that true? Others will say, Genesis chapter 1 says 6 days. How long is a day? How long is a day? 24 hours. So we're talking about 6 24-hour days, and God made everything in 6 24-hour days. And how do I know that? Because that's what Genesis says. Okay? Now, a challenge that we're going to have here is every single way in which I have talked about this. God created everything in 15.6 billion years according to evolutionary principles, but he was guiding over all of it. No. The individual days stand for epochs, but God speeded up there and changed it around there and accomplished this and that, and he wanted life, so he just puts that in there in an otherwise natural world, and everything is going on, and he brings it to this point. Or, no, God really tweaked. He really tweaked the timeline of naturalism and jammed it all into 6 days, every single way we are talking about this, even when we talk about 6 24-hour days, we are using to a greater or lesser extent naturalistic assumptions, right? In order for God to create all this stuff, he's got to jam it into 6 days. Well, fortunately, God can do that. But I'm still making an assumption. God will have to do that. I mean, if he wants to get it done that quickly, he's going to have to jam it into 6 days. Now, how does he do that? Well, I don't know. He's God. He can do it. He can speed it all up. He can change things around. He can just call. Now, how does creation really proceed in Genesis chapter 1? Because this is where the real conflict is. This is what we need to understand. The real conflict between naturalism and Genesis 1 is not how long or what order or what method God used to create. Okay? And everything I've just talked to you about is a discussion or a dispute or a debate or a speculation about how God did this. I can tell you how God did it. This is what the Scripture actually says. The Scripture actually says, and God said, let there be, and there was. Okay? Did that take a whole day for him to say, let there? Did he say, let there be, and then it took a whole day for this to happen? Did God say anything? Was there a voice booming out there somewhere? Or when it says, and God said, are we not really saying, well, actually, he said it to himself in his own mind? Who's he talking to? In other words, and God thought, and God willed. And it was. Now, here's where the irreducible conflict lay. That statement is not just saying it's not 15.6 billion years. That statement is a complete denial that nature had anything to do with it at all. The origins of our universe are wholly supernatural. It sprang from the will of God outright. Do you see that? This is not just, oh, it didn't take him that long. This isn't even, God is so powerful he can reduce it all into an instant. This has nothing to do with the way you encounter the universe. This is just God wills it and it happens. It is a total denial, in other words, a total, complete, absolute denial at the very beginning of the Scripture of naturalism. Now, not methodological naturalism, that works all the time. That's just a practical thing. We keep using that because it keeps working, so we just use it. But it is a total denial that nature had anything to do with the origin of nature. That even makes any sense. It comes from God. All right. It is a supernatural explanation then for all things. It is a supernatural explanation for what we call nature. Okay? Nature just means the way we experience the stuff that God made. That's it. But how did God make it? Did God have to wrestle with natural law? Did he have to figure out how to make these things move that quickly? Or does that statement make any sense at all when we talk about God? Okay? God wills, and the thing is. And God said, let there be, and there was. So the conflict is not how many days, how long were the days, or anything like that. The conflict is, did God simply will it all into existence, or did he have to wrestle with stuff in order to make it work? But fortunately, he's God, so he can do that.
Well, there wasn't any natural law, was it?
Natural law does not exist until God does two things in a row. Okay? Once God does two things in a row, we can say, aha, a law, until the third thing is something different. Okay? Then we have to keep adjusting our laws. you really want to look at what we call natural law is just observing the habits of God, the ordinary ways that he does things. So if I were to take some object and drop it, okay, let it go, we all know what's going to happen, right? It's going to drop. But of course, I could let it go and it not drop. God could just cause it not to drop. Okay? You agree with that? All right, here's my question. Which requires God to do something? The first or the second? Which is more difficult for God, the first or the second? See, if you think, okay, the first one is easier because, what do you mean the first one's easier? You mean God has nothing to do with the pen dropping? But if it doesn't drop, then God has to do that? As though God has to sort of lift it up against the weight that otherwise would pull it to earth? Or do we say, no, normally God would cause it to fall, and if God doesn't cause it to fall, what will happen? It won't fall, okay? If God doesn't cause it to exist, what will happen? It won't exist, okay? So whether the thing falls or not, we are observing the activity of God. So we almost always see it fall, right? So that's the normal habit of God. And he's very, very orderly in this way. Think about how different life would be if sometimes it fell and sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it fell faster than other times. Sometimes it observed this law and sometimes that one. Supposing what we call the constants, various constants in physical property. We're changing all the time according to God's whim and will, how he feels this morning. Imagine how different life would be. But life isn't that way. God is very regular and planted us in this universe where everything is very regular so that, well, for us, God doesn't need it to be regular. And it is no harder for God to keep the pen from falling. We don't even say keep it from falling. He just doesn't cause it to fall. If you think one is more difficult than the other, then you are imposing sort of naturalistic assumptions on God that don't exist. Nothing happens except that God is doing it. And so it's as hard for God to work a miracle as not. You see that? All a miracle is God does something unexpected for us. In that sense, the fact that I'm stuck to the ground like this, walking around, we can describe it as gravity, but it's God's work. He's keeping this happening. He's making sure that the structural forces that we measure and that architects carefully crafted and so on to keep this building up, he's the one why that works, okay? It's nothing about wood and stone and gravity that automatically work with or without God. This is how God does this. And if he didn't always do it this way, then we would never build anything. Do you see? Because we'd never know what was going to happen next. Well, that's okay. We can live in a world like that, but it'd be a very different world than one we live in. Think about little children. I mean little children. For little children, everything is like magic, isn't it? Nothing is regular because they've never experienced two things in a row. Everything is always different. And in time, of course, they realize that, no, actually, there's lots of patterns and lots of things that we can count on, but you can get by. I guess if it's not too chaotic. So a miracle is just God doing something that we did not expect, and it's not according to the normal rules, but it's no more difficult for God to do something like that than not. For that matter, I mean, just keeping us going, keeping us in existence is the basic thing that God does. Let me say one more thing about creation. We typically think of creation and we think of the first moment, right? When God says, let there be. But creation is not something that God starts and then just lets it go. Creation has no independent existence. So if God doesn't keep it going, what happens? It just stops. It doesn't even stop. It just vanishes. I mean, without God's constant maintenance. So rather than thinking of creation as something that happened a long time ago, think of creation as something that began then as continuing. It has to continue. Because without God's constant creative power, we cease. Everything ceases, okay? So how do we know that there's a God? Well, we're here. Because we don't exist without the power of God. Okay, so what we're really talking about in Genesis chapter 1 is that God is so supreme over everything else that everything owes itself to the will of God. And therefore, there's no such thing as a discussion of anything apart from the will of God. And any effort metaphysically to divide God from the things that exist because of God is like dividing by zero. Okay? You get an error. It doesn't make any sense. It's nonsense. Okay? That is a nonsensical statement. I want to talk about what I call a supernatural mirage. Okay? To the naturalist mindset, even when the supernatural is detectable, it is nevertheless invisible. That is, its nature is invisible. Now let me explain what this means. Is the supernatural ever detectable? Constantly. Didn't I just say? All of life really is supernatural. The fact that it's very regular, we slap on it the label of natural. But the reality is, the universe is here by the continual supernatural power of God. Do we detect the ongoing existence of the universe? I'm detecting it. I'm seeing clues of it all over the place. So are you, okay? So God's supernatural activity is detectable, not necessarily. God can do all kinds of things, and we have no idea that he's doing them. But he does many things quite supernaturally right in front of us, and we detect them. Do we detect them and recognize them as supernatural? Okay. The naturalist never will. Okay. The person who believes that God acts in, like the Christian might sometimes say, "Oh, I think that was something special." Well, I think God was particularly involved there. But the naturalist mindset will never say that. Why not? Because it's a naturalist mindset. If you're a naturalist mindset, think about it this way. I just said nothing exists apart from God. So if we're going to talk about something existing apart from God, what are we talking about? A contradiction, a nullity, nothing. There's nothing to talk about. Okay, the naturalist says the same thing in reverse. They say there is nothing outside of nature. Nature is everything. So if you're going to talk about something outside of nature, what are you talking about? Something that doesn't exist. This is really important because if a naturalist looks at something happening, how will they interpret it? A natural occurrence, whether it is or not. And so I'll use an example. I want you to ponder a thought experiment with me. You all know the story from John chapter 2 where Jesus turned water into wine. Okay? Now, supposing that there had been a naturalist at that wedding and murmurings at the end of the wedding. There was something on Twitter that the water had turned into wine. And it's suspected that Jesus did it. Okay. What would the naturalist say? Well, it's a rumor. I don't know. Did the water turn into wine? What's the answer? The water did not turn into wine. Was it a trick? Did these people get confused? Did they think that they were getting the bottles filled with water and they actually got the jugs filled with the fine wine? I mean, there's lots of explanations. In other words, if you're the naturalist watching this, a miracle has just happened in front of you. Did you see it? You did not. Do you have explanations? Many. Supposing you actually saw it. You saw the water. Then you saw the servants take the water. And then you saw the guy dip into the water. And you heard him say it was wine. And you went over there and looked in there. And by golly, it was wine. What now?
Must be a trick.
Yeah, it's a fancy trick. My mind is playing. I thought that was water. He made me think that it was water. They made me. This is all a trick. How do we know it's a trick? Because you can't turn water into wine. So we know that that didn't happen. Because to make wine takes time, doesn't it? From a naturalistic point of view, according to nature, it takes time. So this didn't, it cannot be what it looked like. So it's okay, it's something else. All right, let's suppose that you were forced to watch, drink, water, wine, okay? Just as Jesus says, let there be wine, and you see it's suddenly wine. And so now, is it possible to take a naturalist and put them into a position where they have to deny everything they'd always thought and say, something weird is going on here, unlike anything I ever thought before. I'm going to have to revisit some of my naturalistic assumptions. Is it possible that God could work such a miracle there at that wedding that even the most hard-hearted atheist would have to say, I'm going to ponder that? What do you think? Yes. Yeah. If you do it right in front of somebody in a way that just answers every one of their possible, so that they can't possibly say it was a trick, they can't possibly say, they just have to admit it. Think about the problem, though. Who are they going to tell? And when they tell that person, how are they going to convince them that it was a miracle? If they're talking to another with a naturalistic mindset. Because even if I am thoroughly persuaded, what's my buddy going to say? Fella, he tricked you. Fella, you're nuts. You need to see a psychiatrist. Write something. How is he going to know that you did not actually witness this supernatural event? How is he going to know that? Because there is no such thing as a supernatural event. So even though you saw it and you are now convinced, it doesn't matter. It doesn't go farther than that. The naturalistic mindset is always going to have explanations. But it's more than that. Let's continue with the thought experiment. And let's suppose that I have a nice glass of red wine right here. My thought experiment is this. We are now, all of us, what's the word for a winologist? There's a word. What's that? Well, but there's actual...
Enologist.
An enologist. We are all now a team of enologists. And if you're not an enologist, we have an unlimited budget to go hire them, okay? So we are going to get all kinds of wine experts and scientists with every instrument known to man, and here is this glass of wine. Unbeknownst to any of us here, this wine was just created by Jesus 3 minutes ago. It was water before that. Now, let's just say that's true. And there's my glass of wine. And I will ask you then to do whatever, taste it, whatever equipment you have to run it through, whatever experts need to taste. I want to know everything you can tell me about that glass of wine. What are some things that we can discern about that glass of wine? Can we tell whether it's red or white? I already told you it's red. We can look at it, okay? Can we tell whether it's dry or sweet? We can taste it, okay? Can you tell me what kind of grapes that came from? Can you tell me what kind of climate grapes like that grow in? If you were really an expert, can you tell me what kind of a year it was when those grapes were harvested? Can you tell me anything about what kind of vats the grapes were fermented in? What kind of process was used to make this wine? Because there's more than one process. Again, we have an unlimited budget to get as many different experts here in whatever sensitive chemical analysis of that wine. Can you tell me how old the wine is? Well, let's see. a wine like that takes at least 3 years. Could be up to 15 years old, but I would say tasting it 5 years. Probably grown in this valley of France, I would say. Tastes to me like a 2015 vintage. This is the kind of grape, this is how those grapes are grown. This is the heritage of those grapes, where they come from and what kind of grapes and who produced those and what kind of vineyards actually produce this kind of wine. And when they started to produce this wine, how much it costs. Can we derive all of that from that? Probably so, right? Probably so. We have engaged in a naturalistic inquiry of that wine. We are assuming certain things. What are we assuming? That that wine made its appearance into this world the way all other wines do. We are going to assume a sort of a methodological, naturalistic approach to this cup of wine. And we're going to be able to discern all kinds of things about it. The things that we are going to discern from our winologists and all of our scientists and all our equipment, all of these things are going to be internally consistent. Okay? Nobody's going to look at this wine and say, I've never seen a wine like this before. It's just blank. It sure does taste good. It's blank. There's no chemicals in here. This was not made with any grapes. We wouldn't do that, would we? That wouldn't be wine if we were tasting that. We're tasting wine, and that means we're tasting a particular kind of wine. And that means made from a particular kind of grapes. And so it's going to be internally consistent. It's going to be apparently accurate. We're all going to agree that, yeah, that's a red wine, and that's a dry wine, and that kind of wine comes from this sort of thing. We're all going to agree on that, and we're all going to be able to go out to the local shop and buy another bottle of wine like this, and we'd taste it and say, yep, that's right. I can see how these two wines are related. Okay, it's going to be internally consistent. It's going to be apparently accurate. It's going to match up all of our data that we're going to have with all other kind of wines. Okay, and it's going to be wrong. All of it is going to be wrong. 100% wrong. It's not 5 years old. It did not come from these grapes. It was not produced by this process. All of it was absolutely wrong, because Jesus just made that wine 3 minutes ago. It was water before that. Can we see that? Is there anything in the wine that will tell us that that was water 4 minutes ago? No, by the nature of the... Now, the naturalist will say, well, that's not possible, because you can't turn water into wine like that. But what if the naturalist is wrong and doesn't know it? This is what I'm talking about, is the mirage. We can subject a supernaturally created thing to a naturalistic inquiry, and we're not going to get a blank. We're going to get an answer. We're going to get an answer that looks right. We're going to get an answer that's consistent in every regard, except that it was wrong. As a matter of fact, it was wrong. Does it matter that it was wrong? It only matters that it was wrong if we really needed to know whether that existed 4 minutes ago, if we really needed to know that, okay? But otherwise it doesn't really matter. But in fact, it was wrong. We already talked about what if you actually saw it happen. Okay, well, that's fine for you. Then you would know 4 minutes ago that didn't exist. But I'm not going to be able to convince any of you. I'm just not going to be able to. It's my word against... It's not going to work. A naturalistic inquiry into a supernatural origin of the universe is likewise going to produce results that are internally consistent, apparently accurate, and wrong. Supposing that God did not create our universe X number of years ago, but 10 minutes ago. All of us have only been in existence for 10 minutes. But God, because he's God, created all of your memories and everything exactly as they are now. He just willed it to be so. Could we tell? And the answer is we couldn't. So what am I really saying? What I'm saying is, if we have a supernatural origin, not only is that invisible to detect with naturalistic means, but worse than that, it will produce a result that will seem correct, but will not be correct. Right? Just by the nature of, as soon as you introduce, and that's why naturalists will not abide the supernatural. They can't have it, because if they have it, then all bets are off. We simply can't speak about where things came from, because we have to make naturalistic assumptions. And if you say there's a God out there, what can we say about that? From the Christian point of view, we essentially assume methodological naturalism, at least from the beyond the flood onward. Okay, it's fair to say that the origins of the universe are thoroughly supernatural. They're just not subject to a natural inquiry, not because their instruments aren't sensitive enough, not because we don't know where to look. Well, let me give you a real simple example. The day after the sixth day, if you're suddenly Adam, you're not Adam. You're a scientist, and you want to know how old the universe is, and you see this tree next to you, and you cut it down. What shall we do? Count the rings, right? Will there be rings in that tree? Or will it just be blank? Okay? There's no rings here. What is this? Could we look at the stars in the sky and say, I recognize that star. That star is 15 billion light years away. Or 3 million light years away. Or 5 light years away. What do I conclude? Well, this light got here, there must have been at least that long. And the answer is, no, it's one day old. Who would have thunk it? But there is no instrument, there's no experiment, there's nothing that you could do to detect that. Well, how are you ever going to know that? How will you ever know that everything had a supernatural origin like that? There's only one way. God who created it will have to tell you. Otherwise, you'll never know. Just by the nature of it. Okay? So whether we're talking about the Big Bang or whether we're talking about evolutionary theory, all of these are the mirage that you're going to get, because you're going to come up with something. When you start examining things with a naturalistic assumption and taking measurements and building theories and models, you're going to come up with something. You will come up with something that will try to explain all the data. And if it doesn't explain it all, you'll do the best you can. And if new information comes up that throws your old theory into disarray, what will you do? You'll build a new theory that will take into account the new information. But that new theory will also be a naturalistic one. It will always be so. So you're always going to have an explanation of what kind of wine that is and how old it is and so on. And you're always going to have something. Whether it has anything to do with reality or not, you're never going to know. All I'm wanting to tell you is, if Genesis chapter 1 is correct, and the way things came into being is, and God said, let there be, and it was so. If that is the case, then there is no way that a naturalistic inquiry into this world will ever be able to discern that. No rationalistic understanding will ever be able to discern that, because it is of a different order. The only way you're going to know is if God tells you. Okay? So I want you to think about, when we talk about fundamental realities, we do not cede the field to those who say there is nothing out there but nature. We're talking about a lot more than how many days and how long was a day. We're talking about whether, in fact, God is constrained to create things in a natural way so that we can explore the natural world and come up with any conclusions. And the answer is, he's not constrained. He can do whatever he wants. And when Jesus made that wine, it tasted like wine. Not just like wine, but like good wine. Okay? as though it had been created through natural processes, but it had not. Such for the whole universe as well. And, for all we know, innumerable other things all around us. We're just never going to know that. Okay? All right, let's pray. Lord Jesus, we thank you for your precious words that tell us things that without your words we would never know. We could never know. We wouldn't even know we didn't know them. We know, Lord, that we live in a world of shadows in which we see and we think we understand things that are not so. We pray that you would help us, Lord, to cling to your word as the first and highest truth. And in this way, O Lord, help us to see things that are beyond us. Amen.